that Esther truly is a delightful story in a lot of ways. It's about human love, it's about power, there's intrigue. But when you finish it, you may wonder just why it was in the Bible. Because you finish it, you're thinking back on it, and God was never mentioned. Faith is never mentioned. Worship is never mentioned. Nothing prophetic in there whatsoever. So you kind of wonder, how did it get in the Bible to begin with? But you find out in going through it, and the Jewish race has long held this book as being one of the truly important books of their history, because it shows you how God is at work behind the scenes and how he brings about his will through the choices of other people, through the free choices of other people. You saw that illustration up there that we can throw the dice, but God determines how they're going to land. And it's something like that you wind up seeing through the book of Esther. Now, on a chessboard, the queen is the most powerful figure, always subject to the king, but nonetheless the most powerful figure on the board, which brings us to Esther. Now, the name Esther also can be translated as Venus, the morning star, interestingly enough, which sheds its light after the other stars have gone out, and while the sun still delays to rise. But Esther lived quietly here with her kinsman Mordecai, who remained in Persia when many of the captive Jews during the reign of Cyrus returned to their own land. And the story begins with the king having this big feast for all of his lords and princes. They said the feast went on for 180 days. And yeah, I can't quite picture that one. I don't know what kind of weight gain you're talking about with 180 days of feasting. But in the interest of brevity here, let's just say that during this time frame, the queen is removed, and a search for a new queen begins, which brings us to the young girl of Esther. She was a Jew. Her cousin Mordecai was a descendant of that same family of Saul, a Benjaminite. Let me read just a few verses from Esther chapter 2. And Mordecai had raised Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. And Esther was very beautiful, very fair. And after her father and mother died, he took her as his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and decree was heard, when many of the young girls were gathered together unto the palace of Susa, to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house, to the custody of Haggai, the keeper of the harem. And she pleased him and obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her the things for purification, which such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place in the house of the women. For Esther had not showed her nationality nor her family, for Mordecai her cousin had charged her that she should not show it. Now when every maid's turn was come to go into King Xerxes, after that she had been for 12 months, so were the days of purification accomplished. They spent 6 months bathing in oils of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors. I don't know if any of you guys bought any spa treatments for your wife for Valentine's Day. This one was 12 months. Now that's a beauty treatment. And I don't quite get it. I mean, if I soaked for 12 months, I think I'd be kind of pruny instead of beautiful. But I don't understand this whole thing. But again, in the interest of brevity, Esther becomes queen at the end of this ordeal. And the book of Esther points to a plot to exterminate the entire Jewish nation in the days of Xerxes. And as I said, the Jews hold this book as being one of their most important books because it tells them of God's preservation of their race. If this plot would have succeeded, there would have been no Nehemiah, and far more importantly, no Jesus Christ. But I want to buzz over to chapter 4 just for these last couple of moments we have together. For in chapter 4, Mordecai persuades Esther to speak to the king on behalf of the Jewish people, reminding her that she cannot keep silent at this point, that she is perhaps the only one that could save the Jewish race, that she needs to stand up and be counted, and she could be the one that the king could listen to. And one of those great poetic verses from Esther, where he says, "Who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this?" That her whole life was maybe hanging on that decision, on that one moment, on that one opportunity that she had to step forward and save the Jewish race. She is the only one who could have had access to the king at that point, but she too must be summoned to go to the king. Even for her to go to the king without being summoned, she could be executed for her insolence just in that situation. But she decides that it may be the only way to stop this plot to destroy the Jewish nation, so she decides to go to the king unbidden. In verse 16 of chapter 4, she says, "Go, gather all the Jews that are present in Susa, and fast for me. Neither eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. I also and my maidens will fast likewise. And so will I go unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish." So after 3 days and nights, that means something to us, doesn't it? For Jesus was 3 days and nights in that grave, dead and buried for us to rise on that third day. And on that third day for Esther, she puts on those royal robes and enters the inner courts of the king's palace. But it's that phrase, if I perish, I perish. She was willing to stand up no matter what. We, on Sunday mornings a while back, we were looking at the book of Daniel. And you remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into that fiery furnace, refusing to bow to the king. And that one of my favorite verses in that whole book is where they say, "We believe our God can deliver us, but even if our God does not deliver us, we will not bow down." Like Esther saying, "If I perish, I perish." Sometimes there are some more important things. And I think every child of God, in one way or another, is called to be a living sacrifice. And that will mean something a little different to each of us. But that phrase is just so far from where we live. If you do a survey of churches just around the nation and preaching topics and titles for Sunday morning, in our day and age, it's things like, the power of positive thinking and how to succeed and how to win over worry. Rather trivial when you compare it to, "If I perish, I perish." When you compare it to Paul in Romans 12 saying, "I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service." Or Jesus saying this to his disciples, "If any man would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." And so we talk about that on these Lenten days, what the cross means for us, what it is to take up our cross. And the way you hear it said in our world is altogether different. You hear someone talk about, "Well, it's just the cross I have to bear." And they're referring to some unpleasant thing in their life, some responsibility that they have or something, but something relatively trivial. I remember, those of you that are old classic rock fans like me will remember the Allman Brothers song, "It's Just Not My Cross to Bear." But that's not what Jesus was talking about by a cross. When we think of a cross, maybe we're thinking of a religious ceremony or a church tradition. But to take up your cross meant pain. It meant suffering. It meant death. And I think our Lord calls all of us that are his to that sense where we die to our own plans, to our own desires, to live for something else, to live for something above our own desires and our own plans, to live for something that he calls us to do, something that he's given us to do, some mission that he has put in our hearts and lives. We're not just to believe, you see, but to commit our lives. And that's something altogether different. To commit our lives wherever he leads us. If I perish, I perish. And I just remind us of that from this text tonight. I remind you and ask you to just prayerfully run those words through your mind this week as you think about this story, as you think about your lives. And one of the things I like about the story material that we've been looking at, the study material, the questions that are out there, have a lot of very personal questions in them. And if you've been doing that week by week, you've been challenged with a lot of very personal things in your own life. And one of those things it asks this week is, what risk is God calling you to take? What risk is he calling you to take with your own family, with your own community, at your job or whatever? Some way that maybe he's calling us to stand up. At the office, at school, at home. To stand up and be called his. No matter what. Even if our God does not save us, we will not bow down. If I perish, I perish. Whatever it means to